This is Joseph and welcome to my podcast, INISKWELA. Sa podcast na ito, you will hear me talking about anything that grabs my attention na may kinalaman sa mga Kristiyanong Pinoy ngayon and the broader culture that they inhabit. Tara, maguntahan tayo. Para sa episode na ito, gusto ko magbigay ng personal commentary sa mga Philippine evangelical churches ulit, this time addressing what I believe to be a real but often undiagnosed condition and character ng maraming mga churches natin, and it is the pervasive feminine culture sa maraming mga churches. Now, by saying that, I think that it is sure to raise a few eyebrows. So siguro may mga nag-iisip na kaagad, so what if churches are feminized? Is feminine bad? That is a very sexist thing to say, lalo na sa panahon natin ngayon. O kaya may mga magsasabi siguro, what does that even supposed to mean? Hindi ka ba gumagawa lang ng issue that's not really there? Kung ganyan yung naiisip mo, I would only ask that you would give me a hearing first, because I believe that this is really worth your consideration. What is possibly at stake is actually the faithfulness and the effectiveness of our churches in doing what God has called us to do. So let me run you through a few assertions that actually led me to come to this conclusion that many churches are actually feminized. So magsisimula ako doon sa unang assertion, which is what I believe to be the case, that male and female are actually different, not only biologically but also in terms of their typical characteristics. Now, pag sinabi ko na typical characteristics, ang tinutukoy ko dyan ay yung personality traits, temperaments, yung mga interests, ganun din yung strengths and weaknesses. These typical characteristics exist on the average, on the greater average between male and female, although may mga individual exceptions, but these are generally typical characteristics of each of the sexes. So yun ang ibig kong sabihin sa typical characteristics. So we can speak, for example, of masculine traits and feminine traits na ang tinutukoy natin ay general characteristics that belong to each of these genders. Sinasabi ko na general characteristics lang because we are not ignoring the facts that some females may actually have more masculine traits without saying that they are homosexuals, and some males would have more feminine traits, again without saying that they are homosexual. Pero when we consider the typical, one trait may belong more on the level of the average to a certain gender rather than the other. And I know that this is something that is actually under attack today by people who think that sex is actually unrelated to gender identity or gender expression, because what they believe is that gender is actually just a mere social or cultural constructs that have little or no relationship at all with biological sex. In a previous episode here at INISKWELA, I cited a few reasons why I believe that idea is actually unscientific. Kasi mula pa lang sa conception, mula pa lang sa paglilihi, there are already different development processes na dinadaanan ng isang fetus with an XX chromosome. Yung isang fetus na mayroong XX chromosome, ibig sabihin isang female fetus, iba yung kanyang pinagdadaanan mula sa isang fetus na mayroong XY chromosome, ibig sabihin isang male fetus. A male fetus that has an XY chromosome would be exposed longer to testosterone kaysa sa isang fetus na meron siyang female chromosomes, which means XS. And this is a process, yung testosterone exposure is a process that significantly affects brain development. So ibig sabihin, it is entirely scientific to say that while there is only one human brain, hindi tayo nagsasabi na may iba't ibang klase ng human brain. There is only one human brain, but there's a variation that actually exists in generally binary categories. So merong typical male human brain and typical female human brain. So wala akong claim dyan on superiority or inferiority. Consistent with what I believe in my Christian worldview, I believe in equality but not in uniformity. But that is the scientific case. There is a binary categories when considering the structure of the brain. And these differences are of course expected to play out in society. Ang ginamit kong demonstration dyan ay yung sa mga Scandinavian cultures kung saan meron sila ng mga pinaka-advanced na egalitarian policies. They are mitigating discriminations against genders, against sexes in relation to men and women. And yet, incidentally, they have produced the widest gap, the widest differences between male and female in terms of their career choices. So for example, out of their own free, voluntary choices, yung mga babae mas pinipili talaga nila yung mga trabaho that has more to do with nurturing people, with caring about people like nursing, caregiving, psychology, and it is the men who are significantly choosing those careers that have to do with things and stuff like engineering or STEM field. So it is a scientific case to say that there is a difference in terms of interest. We can say that women are more interested about people, and this is consistent with their reproductive function, of course, of bearing children and of having that infant for the earliest days of its life dependent on its mother. And then men are more interested with things and stuff, so they are the ones who are going to create tools in order to be used for civilizing. Kita na natin yan sa simula pa lang sa mga laruan ng bata. Typically, makikita ninyo yung mga batang babae, ang laruan na nilalaro nila ay manika na inaalagaan nila. Tapos yung mga lalaki naman would have a sword or gun or truck. So you may be tempted to say that these are social constructs, these are cultural constructs, but that is not where the scientific findings are leading us so far. And I believe that this only corroborates the biblical view that male and female are actually different, that God has only created two sexes and genders as stated in Genesis chapter 1. And all throughout the Bible, this is only a given that these differences are going to play out even in the very narratives of the Holy Scriptures. Ano-ano ba yung mga differing characteristics na ito? Let me enumerate a few that I think is important in my line of thinking. Una, it is a statistical facts that men are generally more aggressive than women. So in this sense, we can say that aggression is more typically a masculine trait. Again, hindi ko sinasabi na totoo ito sa lahat ng individual male or individual female. Ang pinag-uusapan natin ay yung generalities because certainly there are women who are quite aggressive. And perhaps we know that from our own experiences. May mga kakilala tayo na babae who are quite aggressive. And there are also men who appear to be as harmless as doves. So parang walang aggression sa kanilang katawan. Although I would suspect that at times it is because it is actually suppressed. We are speaking in terms of generalities, in terms of average, and the average usually play out when it comes to the extremes. So consider the statistics, for example, of the population of prisons. There are significantly more men na nakakulong because they are charged for aggressive crimes over women. So mas maraming lalaki yung nai-involve sa mga aggression that are criminal, and it is clearly the case when you look at the population of prisons. There are also more men pag pinag-usapan yung mga combative sports like boxing, wrestling, or other sports that actually require some kind of aggression. Kasi pwede mong isama dyan yung weightlifting or kung ano pa. There are definitely more male soldiers or police over female. There are more men who are getting involved in frat wars than women. So these statistics actually have a wide gap of difference. Na ngayon, isang pwedeng maisip mo tungkol dyan, well, that is precisely what we mean by toxic masculinity. Yung aggression na yan ay characteristic ng mga lalaki, and it is something that really makes our society bad. It is what's toxic in society. Well, no doubt, I would say that male aggression can become toxic. It can become a bad influence in society. But we must remember that it is also a potential force for good, for providing protection, for fighting against tyranny, for combating abuses. And it is for this reason that when we look at the Bible is actually replete with characters of such typical masculinity. So you have that, for example, in the case of a combative David, who actually learned to face up against predatory threats like lions because he was protecting his flock. So it is a controlled aggression. It is a channeled aggression in order to become a force for protection. And in fact, he was able to use that when the Philistines are a threat to the people of God, the Israelites, and it was David who stood up in order to fight against the giant Goliath. So it was a good kind of aggression, and we call that courage. And you have that, of course, in Jesus Christ, who is, we can say, the typical masculine of the highest sense. And certainly he was not just gentle, meek, and mild when he turned those tables in the temple, for example, and when he confronted corrupt religious authorities during his time. So that means aggression, the Bible seems to show us, which is a typical masculine trait, when channeled properly, actually becomes courage to face up to threats, or it could be adventurousness, which means willingness to take up risks, to go to the unknown territory like Abraham in order to build something precious. Kaya makikita mo tong katotohanan na ito manifested hindi lang sa Bible, but even in our archetypal male heroic myths in our culture na makikita mo sa mga aklat, sa mga pelikula. Ang usual na makikita mong plots or narrative that demonstrates some kind of a male heroic is a person who slays the dragon in order to get the girl or in order to get the gold, which is interestingly the story of the Bible itself, because Jesus Christ is the one who slayed the ancient dragon in order to get the girl, who is of course his bride. There must be something in here that is archetypal. And then there is also the journey to the unknown and to the dangerous, like that of Abraham, who was called to go to the unknown place. And there he would find his maturity as he became confronted various threats and challenges and obstacles. So you have that even as early as Odyssey by Homer, or even J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings with Frodo and Sam's journey to Mordor. So apparently, this aggression, which when channeled for good becomes courage and becomes adventure, a good kind of adventure, is actually something that is good. So the proper training to men, it seems, is not to tell them to become less aggressive. In fact, I would say that the problem of young men today seems to be passivity. They are too passive. They couldn't even get to initiate with a woman. So ang tamang pagtawag is to channel aggression for good, because God knows what He is doing when He created men. And when He created men to have that typical characteristic of being aggressive. Can be for bad, but it definitely was meant and intended for good. Isa pang example ng general differences between male and female, focusing on the women naman, it is again a statistical fact that women are generally more agreeable than men. So in this sense, we can say that agreeableness is more typically a feminine trait. Kapag sinabi nating agreeable, we are referring to that trait na ito yung nagtutulak sa isang tao dun sa kanyang desire in order to please other people, and that guardedness in order not to be offensive to anyone, in order not to offend. Again, this is generalities. This is the typical, without saying that every individual women are agreeable and every men are less in agreeableness. There are women who are really quite less on agreeableness, and you may have known a few, and there are men who are actually high on agreeableness. But we are speaking in terms of generalities. Women, for example, they are statistically more likely to be hired as secretaries. So for example, meron kang kumpanya at naghahanap ka ng magiging secretary mo, there is someone who is applying who is a male, who is a man, and there is another one who is applying who is a woman, and sabihin natin providing that they are equal in terms of their competency, but most likely it is the woman who is going to be accepted to become a secretary when competing against a male. And it is not because some conspiratorial oppression by straight men bureaucrats sinisigurado nila na yung mga babae ay secretary lang. It is not the case, but because it is women who are actually good at the job precisely for their typical characteristics. And that is the characteristic of being agreeable. They are good at doing as they are told better than hard-headed men. Hard-headed men are more likely to argue and to do it their own way. So they do not make good secretaries, typically and on the average. To balance that out, para hindi nyo ako i-accuse ng sexism, if a woman wants to be a CEO and wants to hire a male secretary, well, she is definitely free to do so if she wants. Although I think that if you look at it in terms of statistics, even those women who are at the top of the companies, those who are CEOs, for example, they're not really very high on agreeableness. So in that sense, they have integrated quite well their masculine traits. Another example in terms of the extremes is that it is simply statistically true that there are more women who are victims of abuses, whether sexual abuse, domestic abuse. There are more than men because men are more likely not to put up with abuse. They are more likely to say no and to assert themselves against abusers. And this is the extreme, and this is the manifestation when that feminine trait of agreeableness becomes uncontrolled. So there is a desire to please, there is a desire not to offend, and it can be taken to the extreme of being paralyzed against manipulation and coercion. Let me just say that it is not victim blaming, because I believe that no one should be abused just because they are agreeable in personality. We are just speaking here in terms of statistics, and it is statistically true that more women are victims of abuses. So the point is, it is scientific, it is statistical, and it is more importantly biblical truth that men and women are different not only in their physiology but also in terms of their personality traits. This is a biblical thing to affirm. So that is my first assertion. And what follows in that assertion is the observation that when you look at the Bible, it is clear that men are the ones who are given the charge to lead the church in order to fulfill its mandates and its mission. And what that implies, I believe, is that masculine traits are particularly more employable to the task of bringing the church where the church should be according to Christ's design. So kapag sinabi ko na ang church ay hindi dapat feminized yung kanyang culture, hindi ko sinasabi na ang dahilan niyan ay feminine is bad, but because the fulfillment of the mandates of the church actually require godly masculinity. And I will hope to argue that with 2 examples. Yung una kong halimbawa is that one of the main mandate of the church is to go to missions. And missions actually require courageous adventure. And a feminized church would rather stay in security and comforts. And that is not good. The mandate of the church is to go to unknown territories. In fact, even facing up to the dangers that may be lurking in those unknown territories, just like the typical heroic myth of going to a journey, of journeying to the unknown, even though there may be risk there. In fact, there may be sickness there. In fact, there may be death there. And yet there is willingness to brave it still. Not because we are aimlessly suicidal, but in order to advance a noble cause. This is adventure. This is the typical male heroic myth of journeying to the unknown, of going to Mordor, of going to an unknown land. Kaya pag tinignan mo yung Book of Acts, it is actually men who are tasked to propagate the mission abroad. And you have that in a particular case in the life of the Apostle Paul. And man, that was quite an adventure, yung kanyang buhay. Hindi ko sinasabi na yung mga babae, they can't participate in missions. We are talking here about the typical, and because it is a typical masculine trait to become adventurous, to become risk-taking even, and to have the courage to go to the unknown, that is required in missionary endeavors. So a feminized church would shrink from that and would rather stay in the place of comfort and security. So missions require masculinity. And another mission of the church is given to us in Jude, where the church is actually called to contend for the faith that was once delivered to the saints. So meron tayong duty to protect the truth. And protecting the truth often means calling out errors, calling out heresies, and calling out lies that are corrupting what is true, that are corrupting what is pure. And this requires courageous stance for the truth, even if it offends everyone. Kagaya ni Athanasius sa history during the time when Arianism actually lay hold of much of the church. And yet we remember those words, Athanasius contra mundum. Now, a church that is feminized, meaning a church that is high in agreeableness, would seek to offend the fewest possible people and to please the most possible people. So ang mangyayari sa ganyang church is that there would be an avoidance of controversy, even perhaps when it is necessary, and there is always the taking of the least resistance at everything when we may in fact being called to engage in the conflict. As I've said, hindi ko sinasabi na masama yung feminine traits of agreeableness, but it is not good when in relation to the church's faithfulness to these mandates. So it seems that these typical masculine traits are really what should pervade in the culture of the church if it is going to fulfill its mandates and its missions. And that is the reason why men are particularly charged in order to become the leaders of the church. And that brings me to the third assertion, and it is an observation that men are actually being lost, even young men, because of this feminized culture of churches. Merong libro dyan si David Murrow, I'm not sure kung tama yung pronunciation ko ng pangalan niya. Ang pamagat ay Why Men Hate Going to Church. And he actually used a George Barna statistics kung saan ipinapakita na across the world, there are at almost every level, women outnumbering men in their participation to church life. And we can simply ask, is it possible that the reason why this is so is because there is nothing in most churches now that actually appeal to men, even to young men. Nothing that spawns their adventurous and aggressive nature, which is there by God's design. Perhaps with all its preoccupation to become agreeable and pleasant and to offend no one. In fact, sa maraming mga churches, it is most likely na yung mga kabataang lalaki would be counseled na maging banal at maging kagaya ni Kristo, which translates to not become aggressive at all, like a rabbit who's only good for praying, P-R-E-Y, praying. So sasabihan sila, be a lamb like Jesus. And there is no call to incorporate the courageous lion side of the one who actually turned tables. So siguro iniisip ng mga lalaki, if the church can only produce spineless men who are harmless, maybe this is not the place for me. And if the church is going to be feminized and they are going to praise and exalt feminized men who can only nod because they have no ability to stand up against corruption, against compromise, well, those are the ones who are actually dangerous men. Those are the ones who I would consider that's actually toxic masculinity, because they are followers of the first Adam who gave up his duty to lead, to become aggressive in slaying that dragon from the very beginning. So they are followers of this Adam rather than the second Adam, the last Adam, Jesus Christ, who did what has to be done. Yung paborito kong illustration dyan ay yung sa Narnia, kung saan kinikwento ni Mr. Beaver kay Susan, yung si Aslan, and Susan asked if Aslan was safe, and Mr. Beaver said, he is not safe, but he is good. And Aslan, of course, was the symbolical character for Jesus in the narratives of Narnia. So Christ-like men also are not to be safe and harmless. They are good men who are able to integrate their lion side, like the lion side of Judah, and to channel it for good, to channel it for construction, to channel it for protection. So yun yung tatlong assertions ko dito tungkol sa feminized church. Yung isang ina-anticipate kong objection, because I also asked myself this question, if the church is supposed to be masculine, as I am insisting or claiming, why are there imageries of the church that are actually feminine? So for example, tinatawag ang church sa New Testament as the bride of Christ. Well, let's think about that. So sinabi ko na typical feminine trait ang agreeableness, which means women on the average have more of the tendency to please and not to offend. Yan yung dahilan ko bakit sinabi ko that this is not bad, because the church must certainly be feminine in that sense in relation to Jesus Christ, but to Jesus Christ exclusively. At ang ibig sabihin nun, the church is not going to be bride of the world. The church is not going to be bride of the states or the government. She must not even flirt and compromise her praise sa mga institutions na ito, because her exclusive brideness is for Christ and for Christ alone. So it is in that sense that the church is feminine. Another imagery that we have in the Bible is the imagery of motherhood. Kasi tinawag ang church ni Apostle Paul sa Galatians as Jerusalem, our mother, which I believe is referring to spiritual Jerusalem, the church, which is portrayed as a mother. Now, the church is the mother to the believers because she must possess those typical feminine traits, which are the desires to care for people, to nurture people, and to protect people, like a mother. And that is certainly what the church should be for those who are under her care. She must be a nursing institution. In that sense, there is that feminine imagery of motherhood. So there's my few comments. I hope I have laid it out clearly, and please consider it, give it thought, because again, as I have said, what is at stake possibly is our faithfulness and effectiveness to be what we are called to be as a church.